Well, hey everybody. In this video, we're going to be interacting with some content about how you would go about determining which religion is true, and if there is even a way of sorting through all the many religions in the world and finding something that's true.
My question when it comes to religion is that there are so many different religions out there, and every religion believes that they are right. And so in virtue of that, I tend to think that it...
And he actually is, Michael Knowles, who's the one talking to these two guys, is right. That's not actually true. It's not that every religion thinks that they're right and everybody else is wrong. There are certain ones that do, but there are other ones that would be much more subjective and would be much less dogmatic about the whole thing. But the bigger point that he's making is fair, that there are truth claims in different religions.
How do you know which one is the correct one if there are so many out there?
Well, there are a lot of different theories of physics, right? And they contradict one another. So how do you know which one is right? There are a lot of different theories of evolution. And if you're inclined to, be really gung-ho about evolution, well, which one do you think is right? Is it Darwin? Is it Lamarck? Is it some newer strand of either of those? You use your reason, and you separate fact from fiction, and you believe the more persuasive arguments, and you throw out the less persuasive arguments.
Yeah, so this is important. The idea that there is disagreement does not mean that we just say, well, there's no possible way we could know something. It is a little bit odd that we do this when it comes to religion. And maybe it's not odd because there's a more obvious faith element when it comes to religion than there are with some other things. But there's lots of areas where we wouldn't just say this. We wouldn't say with math, like, well, there's some people who disagree on this, so what can you do? We don't do that with history and different elements. Like, well, some people who say this, some people who say this, there's just no way to know. We might still have the debate, and we might in certain things say, we're not as sure about this as we are about this. But still, we would say, no, we think that there are right answers out there, and there are ways of determining at least more likely explanations than less likely explanations. And so it is a little bit odd that when it comes to religion, there can be almost this slam dunk like, well, there's lots of religions. There's just clearly nothing that we can do in order to determine if one is true and the others are not true.
And that's what you do with religion when it comes to theology. Theology is faith-seeking understanding. So it's applying logic and the rigors of reason to religious claims. And religion is just simply a habit of virtue that inclines the will to give to God what he deserves. So we talk about multiple religions, but there's really only one religion. And we're all just trying to figure out what it is.
But do you believe that other sects of that religion are incorrect or
I don't believe in
worse?
sex before marriage, if that's what I'm Catholic.
Yeah.
I think that's true. I think that's the true faith. So in as much as a religion contradicts that, I think that religion is wrong. Of course, but that's just Aristotle's non-contradiction principle, right? You can't simultaneously believe things that are in opposition.
I think so. With this, just as a note on this, so he's Catholic, I'm Protestant, and so when it comes to this, if we're talking broadly about different Christian denominations or different sects within Christianity, it's not quite the same question as Christianity versus Islam or Christianity versus Buddhism, where we could say, like with Catholicism, I could say that there are different areas where I think Catholicism is just wrong. When it comes to whether it's something like infant baptism, whether it comes to praying to the saints, when it comes to certain things about, Mass versus communion and things like that there are a number of things I'd say like, all right, I think this is wrong. And there's also just different Christian denominations that are Protestant that I think, I mentioned infant baptism. I'd be like, yeah, I think that's people who do infant baptism. I think that's incorrect. That's not the same as when we're talking about a whole different religion, because the issue where I think that they're incorrect is sometimes they range, but on the overall is a minor enough issue that I believe that they have still embraced the transcendent major truth. But there might be some areas where I think that they've come to incorrect conclusions. And so you still use the same sort of reasoning that he's talking about here. You still look at it and say, all right, the fact that some Christians have, women elders, and some Christians don't have women elders. Doesn't mean like, well, there's no right answer to this. There is some sort of answer to this. It just means that there's disagreement about it. The idea that some Christian denominations baptize infants and others only baptize those who are at a point where they're able to give a confession of faith, that doesn't mean that there's no right answer on it. There is a right answer on it, but it just means that people have disagreed on what the right answer is on this. And so I think that there's room still to say we're seeking understanding, as he said, we're having faith seeking understanding, but we would view that differently than somebody who has embraced Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, because that's a completely different framework that doesn't have Jesus at the center, doesn't have the gospel at the center, doesn't have the triune God at the center. So it's a similar reasoning in the overall sense, but it's different in terms of the stakes.
I think even the most atheistic person would say that certain religions seem more plausible than other religions. What would be a good example of this without offending a wide swath of the audience? Most people out there would say that Christianity is more plausible than Scientology, right? Why? Well, because Scientology makes all these crazy claims about machines and technology. Okay. Like space aliens. Right? Okay. Well, kind of actually the claims are you guys Scientologists? Mm-hmm. You are. I had a feeling. Okay. A bad example then. So we would say that, okay, well, if Christianity is more persuasive than Scientology, then, okay, you've just dismissed one of the religions. Well, how about the other ones? Do you think it's more persuasive than Islam? I do. I think that the historical claims of and the theological claims of Christianity are more persuasive than Islam. Okay, we got rid of that one. How about Judaism? I, have great respect for my Jewish friends and my Muslim friends and even Scientologists, some of them. But Judaism says Jesus is not who he says he is. Christianity says Jesus is who he says he is. Well, I don't know. What is it? And then one investigates this question, and I've arrived at the conclusion that he is who he says he is. Okay.
And the Judaism one is an interesting one because there is so much shared belief between those who are observant Jews and between those who are Christians. We have a whole, for us, Old Testament in common, where we say we believe that that's God's word and we believe that this is how God has worked in different ways. But it's interesting because it's able to narrow down sort of the difference to one specific question. There's more at stake, but to one specific question, and it is that question about Jesus. Is Jesus the Messiah? Is he the fulfillment of all of this? We believe that Jesus didn't come and sort of change Judaism. We believe that he came as the fulfillment of the entire law and prophets and Psalms. And so in there, it's interesting in this overall idea of saying, the difference is not just somebody saying, well, I grew up Christian and I grew up Jewish. It is the question of, well, what do you believe about Jesus? And really, in many ways, that's the difference, because I believe that Jesus is the Messiah, is the Son of God, is the one and only Savior. That's the question between everything. The question always comes back to Jesus. And the difference between Christianity and Judaism just puts it highlighted because there's so much that you have in common. And then that's the divergent point.
So there goes that religion. How about Buddhism? Well, all the Buddhists I know are just like liberal women in northern Westchester who wear tight pants and, meditate during this. So they're not right about anything. I can easily dismiss that religion. How about Hinduism? Some of my best friends are Hindus. But that's a non-theistic religion. So that's a pretty easy one to reject off the bat because it contradicts plenty of logic and conclusions I've already come to about the nature of being and who created everything. Okay, well, I think we've just handily gotten rid of all the other religions, right? Now, you might say, well, there's a lot of different sects of Christianity. That's true. I just think that the historical claims and the theological claims of the church go back to antiquity. They're well attested to over 2,000 years, and so that's how I landed on that one. Your mileage may vary. Maybe you come to a different one. But at the very least, we've landed roughly in the neighborhood of one another here. We don't just have to throw up our hands and say, well, Johnny says this and Jack says that, so who the hell knows? Everyone can believe whatever they want. Let's not try to arrive at any.
Yeah, that last point I think is so important. And this is where a lot of what he's talking about is the interaction between faith and evidence. And he talked earlier in the video about faith seeking understanding, which I think is a really important idea. Faith seeking understanding is important because I think it critiques the idea that some of us think that we're just like a blank slate, we're totally objective, and we're only looking at the evidence. And that's not true of anyone. Like you can't function in life without having some presuppositions, even if it's the law of non-contradiction that he talked about earlier, or even if it's the idea that you get to a point where you say, okay, I'm not sure who God is or what God is, but I'm looking at the world and I'm looking at the fact that we're all here, and I can't believe that nothing or that all of this emerged from nothing. So I'm starting with the idea that there is some designer, and maybe I haven't landed yet on who he is or what he is, but at least I'm landing on that. Or just that there's certain things that you have to go into it with. So there's some level of faith. I think we all should acknowledge that, but then seeking understanding with that. And so when you're doing that, you don't have to just throw up your hands and say like, well, because people disagree, there's just no possible way to know. You can't go through life that way. You have to have a way of landing. But you also have to know that when you come to a point of landing, it's not the level of certainty that we need to pretend it is. He even used terms like more likely. Like, is Christianity more likely to be true than Islam, Buddhism, all of these other ones? And I think that reflects the idea that you can't get away from the idea that there's faith involved. You can't get away from the idea of saying, am I like 100% certain that Jesus is the Son of God? And I'm like, well, not in the sense that you might be thinking of, but I have come to believe that. I've concluded that. And it's based on a mix of the faith that I had going into the journey of investigating Jesus, and then also the evidence that I saw for his resurrection, for his impact on the world, for the things that he said and did. All of that is mixed together and saying, yes, I've concluded that he is the Son of God. There still is faith involved. I can't act like there's no element of faith involved. But the fact that there's faith involved doesn't mean that there's no way to come to a conclusion or determine whether you believe something is true or whether you believe something is not true.